Ayes have it. The ayes have it. Congratulations. We're now coming to the motion relating to the National Policy Statement for National Networks. And I call the Minister to move.
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it's me again. It's déjà vu all over again. I will be brief in my opening speech in this particular matter. I beg to move that the House approves the National Network's National Policy Statement, which was laid before the House on the 6th of March 2024. I stand here today as the Minister in the Department of Transport that is responsible for infrastructure planning and delivery, albeit some of my colleagues handle some of the other key DCOs in that respect. The National Network's National Policy Statement, or NNPS, provides the planning framework for determining applications for nationally significant road, rail and strategic freight interchange projects. These are schemes determined under the process set out by the Planning Act of 2008. The NNPS sets out why we need to develop these networks and how applications for projects will be assessed. It does not set out locations of where the national network development will take place, neither is it a transport strategy governing wider transport policy such as active travel. The existing NNPS was designated in 2015. Approximately 30 road, rail and SRFI schemes have been consented since then. Clearly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the draft NPS was subject to public consultation. Alongside this, the Transport Select Committee, led by my honourable friend, undertook an inquiry into the draft. We have made a number of changes in response to the committee's work, and I am grateful to the committee and want to put that on the record for their careful consideration of all the issues raised through both written and oral evidence. I'd like to apologise on the record to the committee that our initial response to their report did not include one particular response to one of their recommendations. I've today laid an amended version of the response in the House which responds to all recommendations, and the recommendation concerned the application of the NNPS to other consenting regimes such as the Transport and Works Act. The NNPS already provides guidance to applicants on this point, and we consider that this strikes the right balance. In the circumstances of the case, you will be aware, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we have invested £24 billion in the country's most important roads through the second roads investment strategy and are committed to the next 5-year plan for maintaining and enhancing the network. In Network North, we recognise the importance of local road infrastructure with major increases in funding for the major road network programme, with some £900 million extra in the Midlands and some £1.4 billion extra in the North to support regional connectivity and growth. Clearly, our railways are a vital part of the country's transport infrastructure, and well-targeted rail investments play a crucial role in growing the economy and meeting the connectivity needs of customers and businesses. We also want to ensure that we support freight in all its forms. Clearly, freight trains carry goods worth over £30 billion per year across a range of different commodities, specifically supporting construction and intermodal flows, which can include customers' goods. It is right that we provide a planning policy framework that enables us to deliver projects and investment as quickly as possible. The revised NNPS does this, and I commend this statement to the House.
Esterson.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I had anticipated a slightly longer opening speech from the Minister. Nevertheless, here we are today to debate a new National Networks National Policy Statement, a decade after the previous statement was published in 2014. The Right Honourable Member for Welling Hatfield originally promised the Government would review the NNPS in July 2021. So here we are, nearly 3 years on from that promise and a decade on from the last published statement. Perhaps the Minister could explain why it took so long to get to this point. The UK committed to 2050 for net zero when we signed the Paris Agreement in 2015. It really isn't good enough that it took 9 years for net zero to finally be integrated into the NNPS. Since 2015, we've moved back on net zero. Just look at the Prime Minister's delay of the end of the sale of new petrol and diesel cars and vans. This rowing back on net zero isn't just a disaster for the planet, it will also worsen the cost of living crisis for drivers, with the estimated cost to consumers of an eye-watering £13 billion in higher fuel costs as a direct result of the Prime Minister's decision. Then there's the mess he made of HS2. The irony and symbolism of where he made the announcement is lost on no one, in a disused railway station at the end of the proposed line. And everyone recognises the impact of the decision on net zero. Even the writers of the thick of it would have dismissed such a plotline as far too implausible. Mr Deputy Speaker, freight trains have 76% fewer emissions than the equivalent road transport capacity. In a moment. But because of the Prime Minister's chaotic decision-making, 500,000 more lorry journeys will add to the clogging up of our roads every year, carrying freight which could have been delivered by rail. I wonder if the Minister is going to respond to that point about rail freight.
I just want to ask him, he raised the point about HS2, and it's a legitimate point that he's making, and clearly the Prime Minister's decision on the 6th of October is to redistribute that to a variety of particular projects, particularly in the north. But what is the Labour Party policy? Is their manifesto proposal to actually continue with HS2 and the second leg, or is that not their proposal?
Well, it's a shame he wasn't standing up to announce that they'd found some miraculous way of returning the consensus. But we know the Conservatives have taken a wrecking ball to the HS2 project, and they blew the budget, which is why they cancelled it. So we're not going to be able to revive it. The rushing of the fire sale of the land, the downgrading of ambition on major stations like Euston, and the reallocated funding originally meant for HS2, which he referred to, I think, in his opening speech. There's no way we are going to be able to revive it. So is it any wonder that the Transport Committee has warned us that there is still a lot of catching up to do when it comes to our climate change commitments and ensuring we actually deliver major infrastructure projects on time and to budget? The Transport Committee's members made their concerns crystal clear when they said that the government should have been proactive and reviewed the NNPS upon the introduction of net zero targets, and should do when any changes are made to net zero target policies. And yet the latest NNPS still leaves gaps, notably its admission that residual carbon emissions as an impact of NSIP schemes are acceptable. There is a further lack of clarity over what residual carbon emissions means in practice, and the policy statement does not offer a process to distinguish between acceptable residual emissions and emissions that would mean carbon targets would not be met. The Transport Planning Society has even warned that the contradiction between the NNPS and the transport decarbonisation plans is potentially incredibly dangerous. Now, we all know our planning system is broken, with too many projects bogged down in development limbo for years on end as they wait for a decision. But the Transport Select Committee has warned that the gaps in this policy statement that I've just identified could actually lead to even more costly and time-consuming legal challenges to major projects on climate grounds, slowing down our snail's-paced planning system even further. And it's the taxpayer that will pay the price for these delays. The flaws in this statement don't stop there either. The government has also failed to take into account local authority level targets and carbon budgets to ensure the local level impact of major development projects is taken into account. Meanwhile, Midlands Connects warns that subnational transport bodies have also been snubbed. Many of these bodies have already developed strategic transport plans at a regional level for supporting economic growth and reducing carbon emissions. They should not be ignored. Now, the National Infrastructure Planning Association has highlighted a lack of clarity in a number of areas, such as the frequency with which policy is reviewed, with the need for further detail to be published. The organisation warned that weak links ultimately result in delays to decisions on development consent orders, which could slow down the delivery of nationally significant infrastructure projects. So, when the Minister responds to the debate, will he tell us whether the government is going to take the action needed so Britain doesn't fall even further behind in the development of vital national infrastructure? And on the subject of existing delays to planning, the planning process has already become cumbersome and slow under this government, with the time taken to grant development consent orders increasing by 65% since 2012 to more than 4 years. In response to the Transport Select Committee's report, which flagged the planning system as a key source of delay in delivering infrastructure projects, the government even admitted itself that it recognises the need for modernisation and reform to the planning system. Now, I've covered the shambolic approach to HS2, but a whole range of other major infrastructure projects his department is supposedly committed to delivering have also seen costs soar and they've seen repeated delays. Years of failure to deliver rail infrastructure upgrades, such as the Midland Main Line, has robbed communities of the benefits of better transport services. And I know he mentioned his so-called Network North proposal at the start, but let me remind him, 85% of these projects are re-announcements. Much of the investment is not even in the north. In fact, some of it includes filling potholes in London, and I don't think it was just North London either. So while the headline figure masks the fact that the money is spread over 11 years, as we established at Transport Questions on Thursday, its average annual funding is only equivalent to a third of the increase in last year's backlog of local road repairs. The consequences of these failures, they're not theoretical, they're all too real. I mean, communities are being denied the huge economic opportunities that transport infrastructure projects can deliver, as they're stuck at the moment relying on creaking Victorian infrastructure. The reality is that this government's track record on delivering nationally significant infrastructure projects is woeful. Today's debate should be an opportunity to review and to learn from what's gone wrong after 14 years of delays, failures to deliver, constant policy changes and contradictions. And unlike this government, Labour is committed to meeting our climate obligations and to getting Britain building again. We recognise the need to address the bottlenecks on our rail network to cut congestion and emissions. That's why we're committed to a credible and transformative programme of transport infrastructure investment to link up our towns and cities, particularly across the North and Midlands. And we also recognise the need to deliver for drivers by cutting congestion, by improving the state of public transport, removing barriers that are blocking the electric vehicle charging infrastructure rollout. And Labour will do what this government has failed to do, will reform the broken planning system to ensure upgrades and progress on our transport infrastructure are actually delivered. Labour's plan for government will accelerate infrastructure delivery, will extend reforms in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, will ensure the action plan for the nationally significant infrastructure project regime covers the Transport and Works Act, Highways Act and the hybrid bill process. We will encourage active travel, support public transport and give local authorities the powers to better integrate their local transport networks. And we've launched an independent review into transport infrastructure driven by industry experts. The review will explore how transport infrastructure can be delivered on time and on budget, learning lessons from the mess this government has made of major projects like HS2. And we will update all national policy statements within 6 months of taking office to ensure they help, not hinder, the construction of important transport infrastructure projects. Labour is serious about learning the lessons from the staggering failure of the last 14 years. We accept that this national policy statement improves on some areas of what came before it. And that's why we won't oppose it today. But the Minister really should set out why he believes that the lack of clarity over crucial points in this policy statement, particularly those around climate change commitments, will not worsen the delays that are already slowing our planning system to a crawl. And if the Minister can't or won't provide those answers today, then Labour will look again at those provisions when we embark on our own review of the national policy statements. And as we seek to both ensure we respect our climate change commitments and that we deliver on our mission to get Britain building again, Labour does not accept the managed decline of our vital infrastructure. We will not accept barriers and blockages to the upgrades we need for smoother, greener transport and to enable everyone to benefit from the enhanced economic opportunities which will follow from better transport connections. Britain is the country which gave the world the railways. Today we should be leading the world in delivering better, greener transport infrastructure. Labour in government will make that a reality.
Chair of the Transport Select Committee, Iain Stewart.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to make a short contribution in this debate. As the Minister alluded to, the Transport Select Committee conducted the scrutiny of the draft. I'm going to use the term triple NPS for ease of speaking. We concluded that in October last year and published our recommendations. Before I get into the substance of my remarks, can I also take this opportunity to place on record my very grateful thanks to the clerk of the committee, Judith Boyce, and her team, and all the advisors we had and the witnesses who gave us evidence. Particularly on topics which can be very technical, their support and guidance was invaluable. So I'd just like to place on record my thanks to all of them for helping me in the work. The review of the triple NPS was overdue, and I'm glad that the government appreciated that there was a need for an update. And I'm also grateful that they accepted one of our central recommendations, in that the triple NPS should be placed on a 5-yearly review, with a shorter term review required if that is justified by policy changes. That doesn't mean that we should look forward to a complete handbrake turn revision of the triple NPS, but it is important that there is the opportunity to consider the wider policy environment and government priorities. I also very much welcome the government's acceptance of some of our other recommendations on the draft triple NPS. Firstly, that the triple NPS should, for clarity, explicitly state the government's understanding of the legal precedent for permitting major infrastructure schemes which increase emissions, where that increase is judged as not likely to harm the achievement of a national target. Secondly, the acceptance that the government should publish its own estimated congestion forecasts for the strategic road network. And thirdly, to reinstate wording on sites of special scientific interest. For without this, the draft didn't contain it, developers may have been able to argue that the impacts of a project on biodiversity would not need to be mitigated. And I'm particularly grateful that that wording has been reinstated. Alongside the government's response to our recommendations, there were two welcome announcements. Firstly, on a review of the transport infrastructure legislation to seek a more effective delivery of future nationally significant infrastructure projects. And perhaps most significantly, the announcement by my right honourable friend for North East Derbyshire, Minister in DLUC, to set up a wider independent review headed by the Lord Banner into speeding up the delivery of major infrastructure projects. Over many governments, I think there has been a frustration that significant projects which are required for the country do take too long. And looking at ways that we can speed that up, I think, is very much to be welcomed. But I just want to caveat that welcome with a suggestion that we also need to look more widely at the strategic decision-making process for transport and related infrastructure. The triple NPS and the two reviews I've mentioned look at the how transport infrastructure projects are delivered, but less so the why and the should. One of the recommendations that we made that the government rejected was that our suggestion that the government should be more transparent in the decision-making process for potential alternative to NSIP choices. And I think that the rejection of that does raise a concern with me. Transport projects are not just put in place for the sake of it. You don't just build a new railway or a road or a port extension or whatever it is just because it's good in itself. They're there for a purpose. They're there to support wider policy objectives. Now, whether that's to support trade, housing and economic regeneration, decarbonisation and many others. Transport doesn't sit in glorious isolation from other policy objectives. And I do question, as a country, over many decades, do we have the right decision-making process in place to appraise and evaluate different projects and ensure a joined-up policy thinking across government? To help explore that area, one of the current inquiries the Select Committee is undertaking is on strategic transport objectives. So at the moment I don't have any recommendations to make. We are still partway through that inquiry. But it looks at a number of issues. So looking at policy development in the round, what decisions should be made centrally and what at the devolved level? How do we inject longer term certainty into the system? So that can help lever in additional private investment. Because transport's always going to fall below more immediate and electorally saleable spending, whether that's on the health service, on police, on defence, and a whole range of other ones. Transport will always be lower down the priority queue under any government. And because the projects, by their very nature, last well beyond the course of a single parliamentary or governmental term, having that longer-term perspective is important. In addition to our inquiry, the Liaison Committee is also undertaking a strategic thinking inquiry to ensure that the way that the government system is wired enables that longer-term planning perspective. So I just wanted to place that on the record. In a 90-minute debate, we're not going to get into all the whys and wherefores of that. So I do welcome the revisions to the triple NPS and the two related reviews that the government has announced. But it's a two cheers from me. There is another element that we need to consider. And I look forward to my committee's work and others contributing to that debate.
Matt Rodda.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to be able to speak briefly in this afternoon's very important debate on transport infrastructure, and indeed a great pleasure to follow the Chair of the Select Committee. I wanted to make a number of points. I will be brief, but I did want to make a number of points. First of all, to support my honourable friend, the Labour spokesman, and also to highlight the importance of investing in infrastructure to support economic growth. And I wanted to raise a few points which matter to my constituents and some which are very immediate and have happened this week. The first point I wanted to make was really just to flag with the Minister the very severe delays on the Great Western Railway main line yesterday, where a number of colleagues and indeed myself, many thousands of commuters were left waiting for some long periods of time, in some cases up to 2 hours, because of a problem with the electricity supply to the overhead wires. And this issue has happened a number of times before for various reasons, and I would urge the Minister to consult with the Rail Minister and feed back the very serious concerns of travellers on this vital piece of infrastructure, which not only connects London with immediate towns like Reading within the southeast of England, but also is of strategic importance across the whole of the UK, connecting Wales, Bristol, the southwest and indeed parts of the Midlands with the capital city. And it's absolutely vital that train travellers can rely on this excellent service, which normally allows very swift and easy access right into the heart of London, now supported also by the Elizabeth line, which is a huge benefit to us all. However, there have been this series of issues with overhead wires, and I just wanted to point that out to the Minister, and I do hope he will flag this up. And I would ask if it's possible if he or a colleague could write to me to just update me on the problems that have been experienced by passengers and to highlight what action is being taken to address that. Equally, Mr Deputy Speaker, on another related very important national infrastructure issue, I also wanted to flag up, and this again is both a regional but a national issue as well, the importance of getting a sensible policy on smart motorways. In my part of England we have had a smart motorway installed along the M4 from West London to as far west as Theale, which is just beyond Reading. And unfortunately, when this work was carried out, it was using the revised spec, which puts refuges up to a mile apart, which in my opinion, and indeed many critics' opinion, is far too far apart to be genuinely safe. I would ask the Minister to look at the policy again. There are other parts of the south of England which have also been affected by this. The M27 around Southampton and neighbouring areas, Portsmouth and other towns in the south, have been affected by a similar similar approach to upgrading the motorway, where again, unfortunately, when the work was carried out, a revised spec was used, not the original one, which had more frequent points of refuge. And I would ask him also, if he can, to write to me and other colleagues on this matter, because it's of great importance to our region and also to the country as a whole. Those are two very significant issues which relate to existing infrastructure. I had a third one which relates to forthcoming infrastructure, and I would also urge the Minister to really implore his colleagues to get the government's act together on electrification of vehicles. Obviously, the government backtracked very sadly and wrongly, in my opinion, on the 2030 target, but in addition to that, it's actually made matters worse by not achieving its intermediate steps which it had set out, such as putting more or suitable number of charging points in motorway service areas. Range anxiety continues to be a major problem and is delaying the uptake of electric vehicle purchases in many cases, and it would be good if the Minister could again update colleagues on the progress of this. I understand that the government has not achieved its target of around 6 charging points in each service area, which again would seem to be a very low bar to achieve, and it may be something like around 4 per service area is the average achieved at the moment. That, even if the 6 was achieved, it would be way below the potential needed for vehicles if they are truly to be electrified quickly and effectively, so that we can hit our targets for tackling the climate emergency and indeed boosting British production of electric cars, which is a success story within our motor industry. Those are some key strategic issues. If I may, Mr Deputy Speaker, I just wanted to mention some areas which aren't directly covered by the policy statement, but which many people would consider should be strategic priorities. The first of those is the absolutely appalling state of the road network as a whole, with the growth in the number of potholes, possibly exacerbated by very heavy rain and frost this winter. It is, in my opinion, a huge challenge for the country as a whole. This is affecting many motorists, people having to pay for expensive repairs, and it's a huge safety issue for both motorists and cyclists. So I would urge the Minister to look into this again and to look at the speed with which the backlog in potholes is being tackled, to support local authorities who are taking a more progressive and imaginative approach. Particularly my own council, Reading Borough Council, has approached this with an invest to save mentality of doing large sections rather than just filling in individual potholes, and that does seem to be tackling the backlog more effectively than some neighbouring authorities, particularly Oxfordshire and Wokingham, which are somewhat behind with their pothole filling. There are other matters which many people would see as strategically important, which may not be under the remit of the statement, including encouraging walking and cycling. Only 1% of the transport budget spent on these important areas, and yet the benefits to the country are absolutely huge, as we heard earlier with the pedicabs bill. The possibility of shifting people from cars into cycling allows people who do have to drive to have more road space. We're not able to create much more road space. It takes pollution out of the atmosphere, which is absolutely vital. It can potentially improve road safety and people's health and fitness as well, so hugely important for the country, yet only 1% of transport spending. Surely we should be looking again at this issue and trying to encourage it, and that includes improving safety, particularly for pedestrians and particularly for women at night, by improving lighting, pedestrian crossings and other measures. In my constituency, I want to commend some local councillors, particularly Will Cross in Redlands Ward, who has ably championed the need for a pedestrian crossing on Upper Redlands Road. It shouldn't take that much effort from a dedicated councillor to deliver something like this. It should be much more routine, there should be more pots of money available, and it should be treated, when aggregated up, as a national priority, even if the individual schemes on their own are small. The overall effect is very significant. Mr Deputy Speaker, thank you for indulging me slightly on the last few points. I am grateful to be able to speak today, and I appreciate the Minister offering to write to me on some of the more immediate and very significant matters. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Chope.
Speaker, just a very short contribution to this.
This is called the National Networks National Policy Statement, and paragraph 3.2, there's a reference to the fact that population growth and economic growth are the most critical influences on travel demand. We know that the government is much preoccupied with the need for economic growth, and I wish them well, and I hope that we make a lot more progress than we have, particularly in terms of economic growth per capita, than we have in the last 10 years. But can I take the other aspect of that, which is population growth? Because we don't have any national policy statement about population growth. Yet it is so fundamental to all the policy making that we do in government and in this House. Why don't we have a national policy statement about population growth? How is it that we, by happenstance, seem to have allowed our population to increase by the best part of another million over the last 18 months? How can this continue? There's a reference in the document to projected growth over the next 20 or 30 years. That there's no basis for that. It seems to me that underlying all our policy making should be a policy about population growth. How many people do we wish to have in our country? What do we think is the sustainable maximum population? How is that population going to be looked after in terms of the age profile? Are we encouraging more of our own people in this country to have children and sustain the population in that way, as they do very effectively in Hungary? Or have we got a different policy which is effectively to import labour into this country, thereby increasing the population exponentially? And I'm not expecting my honourable friend on the front bench to necessarily come up with a definitive answer on this, but I think the point is worth raising. Why is it that we have a national policy statement on national networks, but we don't have one on population growth? And I hope, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that we'll be able to get one quite soon.
Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I have to say that it feels that once again this government is dodging scrutiny. This National Policy Statement for National Networks, or NPS for short, has significant implications for the delivery of our climate and environment targets, and yet rather than giving MPs the opportunity to properly debate it, this government has, it feels to me at least, rather cynically left its approval until the very last minute before the Easter recess, when many colleagues have already returned to their constituencies. There's barely 10 people here in this chamber this afternoon. Now, there are many concerns, in my view, about this particular statement, but I want to focus in my brief intervention on the climate and nature consequences of it, because, as the Minister is well aware, when the review of the NPS was announced in July 2021, it was explained by the then Secretary of State on the basis that the 2014 NPS predated the UK's commitment to net zero by 2050, the 6th carbon budget and the transport decarbonisation plan. Aligning the NPS with our climate targets is, of course, an absolutely essential undertaking, not least because about 10% of the UK's CO2 emissions come from driving on the strategic road network. And according to the National Audit Office, transport-related emissions between 1990 and 2022, I'll say that again, I had too many twos there, between 1990 and 2022 were reduced by only 11%. That's the lowest of any sector. So there is a real problem here, and frankly, this policy statement fundamentally fails to rise to the occasion and to the challenge that that poses. In their 2023 progress report to Parliament, the Committee on Climate Change recommended what they called a systematic review of all current and proposed road schemes, with only those that, and again I quote, meaningfully support cost-effective delivery of net zero and climate adaptation should be taken forward. So maybe the Minister could explain to me why his department has refused to undertake any assessment and why the NPS essentially reverts to the current pre-net zero carbon test. And in the absence of such a review, can he explain how he plans to close the gaping delivery gap when it comes to cutting transport emissions? Just last week, the Green Alliance think tank published the latest update of their net zero policy tracker, and it revealed that transport accounts for 70% of the overall policy gap for delivering the fifth carbon budget. So this is a huge issue, with 37% of the emission cuts that are required having absolutely no policy set out for them at all. And crucially, Green Alliance suggests that measures such as reviewing road building and redirecting funding into public transport would help to close the policy gap. So why isn't it in this plan? Rather than making our constituents ever more dependent on private cars, this MPS should have set out the need for bold rail and urban transport upgrades. It should have been about levelling up public transport outside London and about improving cross-country rail. The first priority of the Transport Decarbonisation Plan is modal shift. Yet the MPS has no target for this, and in fact 7 out of the 8 Department for Transport scenarios on which it's based assume exactly the wrong kind of modal shift, in other words, a shift to cars. And when it comes to active travel, will the Minister explain why it doesn't reference the 2030 target for 50% of urban journeys to be by active travel? Looking at our environmental targets, it is profoundly disappointing that the MPS fails to set out the implications of the new Environmental Act targets at the strategic or scheme level. It's not good enough simply to have due regard to some of the targets. So to conclude, Mr Deputy Speaker, this MPS is not only unclear, and that was a point which has been observed by Professor Stephen Glaister, formerly Chair of the Office of Rail and Road and Director of the RAC Foundation, who has previously told MPs, and I quote, "I do not see clarity in that draft myself." Not only is it unclear, but it fundamentally fails to set out a new direction of travel to ensure the delivery of our climate and environmental targets. In the age of a climate crisis, we need more than just passing references to net zero and muddled attempts to justify the roads programme. What we need is urgent and bold action to decarbonise the transport system, and this statement clearly does not provide that.
Minister to respond.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I will try and address some of the points raised. The Honourable Gentleman for the Opposition raised the issue of freight. He will be aware that we published the Future of Freight strategy, which was a long-term plan in June 2022, which was developed with industry. The plan sets out a cross-modal approach to achieve the long-term vision of a freight and logistics sector that is economically efficient, reliable, resilient, environmentally sustainable and valued by society. I'm obviously the co-chair of the Freight Council alongside Isabel Dedring, who is an independent industry representative. And with respect, the Generation Logistics campaign, which we hosted in the House of Commons, the work that the RHA and others are doing to drive forward true change in freight is, I believe, something that genuinely should be admired. In respect of the points raised by my honourable friend for the Transport Select Committee, I take his 2 out of 3 cheers as a damned by faint praise, but at the same stage, no one is pretending this is perfect and this is a work in progress. We all get that and we all understand that. The idea that this is an insubstantial document when it runs to over 100 pages, that it has been available for public consultation, oral hearings, and that then the Transport Select Committee have obviously done an assessment of it and government has responded to that. With respect, I think this is a very substantial approach to this particular issue, and I endorse the comments that he made in terms of the future plans. The Honourable Gentleman for Reading raised a number of points. I will ensure that the Rail Minister responds to him. On the issue of electrification of vehicles, I want to push back gently. The only point I would make is that one has to be aware, for example, that the network of publicly available charge points is rapidly increasing, with almost 57,000 installed. That's a 47% increase since March 2023. Clearly, more can be done. No one would dispute that. And I echo and share the desire of the honourable gentleman, who I will insult him by calling him a friend of mine, who then makes the very fair point that we need to have more electric charging points, and I take that on board. As to the issue in relation to the Great Western delays, as I say, the Rail Minister will respond. He and others have raised the issue of the state of the roads, and the allegation is made that there isn't a vision to support either local authorities or to address that, or that there was no long-term levelling up plan for the North. Well, with respect, the decision by the Prime Minister in respect of HS2 has done a number of key things. The first is obviously the £8.3 billion has been set out to the local authorities up and down the country, responding to the HS2 profile over 11 years, but a 30% increase in funding for every local authority on average over the last year. And that is genuinely game-changing amounts of money. And also the long-term funding pattern is something that we can absolutely allow local authorities to invest in the future, which is something that every local authority will say they would want more. In terms of the aspiration to support the North, one of the key decisions, of course, was to ensure that almost all of the HS2 money was spent in the North and or the Midlands as affected by HS2, which is why the money is going into Network North, which is why the money has gone into the local transport fund was announced, which has seen some local authorities have their transport budget increased by 9 times in some examples, but has seen hundreds of millions of pounds going out to lots and lots of different local authorities across the board. The issue is also outlined in terms of the type of announcements that the government has made and the direction of travel. And with respect, I'll just outline 5 things that the government has done in the last 10 days alone. So I was proud to announce the Safer Roads Fund. That's a further 35 million in multiple locations across the country to try and enhance the road safety. Last Friday, the Secretary of State announced the zebra buses. Now, for those who don't know them, that's the zero-emission buses. And there are dozens and dozens of locations up and down the country with hundreds of zero-emission buses funded and supported by this government. And clearly, on Saturday, I announced the Active Travel 4 for the Active Travel Fund, which is £101 million. I saw some of the schemes that are going in place in Darlington with the excellent Mayor Ben Houchin and my honourable friend from Darlington on Saturday. I was with my honourable friend from for Chatham and Aylesford to see the 1.2 million that is going into the Medway Active Travel Scheme. And clearly, the autonomous vehicle bill is something that this government has championed as well. And I can see my honourable friend, my co-minister, and I wouldn't say partner in optimism, I think is the best way to say, who is addressing some of these points. And that criticism was further made in relation to the issue of climate change. And I would gently push back because clearly there has been a lot of change in government policy since the NNPS was designated in 2015, in particular the government's commitment to achieving net zero by 2050, the Transport Decarbonisation Plan published in 2021, setting out how transport's contribution to net zero will be delivered. The Environment Act of 2021 introduced a more stringent approach to environmental protection and opportunities for enhancement of the natural environment, publication of the RIS2 and the Integrated Rail Plan, and the support, obviously, for rail freight, including the announcement of the rail freight growth target in December 2023. And the NNPS has been reviewed to reflect these changes in government policy and to remain a robust framework for decision-making on NISP schemes. And clearly, there is ongoing challenge in certain courts to the development of roads on this issue, and we await the decisions of the courts in that particular point. My honourable friend from Christchurch tempted me to become the Home Secretary. That is something that we all know and anticipate is the chances of that are our old friend slim and none. But I will take it up with the Home Secretary as to whether there should be a population growth assessment. But can I thank all colleagues for their contributions today, commend what is a mighty piece of work mighty piece of work, which is the National Network's National Policy Statement, and I would genuinely commend it to the House.
The question is, as on the order papers, may I say aye? Aye. No, I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We're now coming to